Picture this. You are seated at a restaurant table in an American coastal town, dressed the way you would for any seafood dinner back home, half expecting a chilled plate, a polished knife, the quiet choreography you followed your whole life. Then the server arrives with something else entirely. A steaming mountain of shrimp, crab, and sausage glistening with butter, poured directly onto the bare table in front of you. No plate beneath it, no fork beside it, just heat, steam, and the faint sound of a stranger saying, "Dig in." For a visitor raised on the grammar of a European seafood dinner, this is not simply an unfamiliar meal. It is a small violation of an unspoken rule, the kind no one ever writes down because no one ever thought it needed writing. Food this expensive is not supposed to arrive like this. And yet, in kitchens and backyards across the American South, it always has. What happens next is the part almost no one arrives prepared for. The hesitation lasts, on average, less than 30 seconds. Then the hands move in, the butter runs down the wrist, and something in the resistance simply gives way. The question worth asking is not whether the food was good enough to overcome the shock. It is why the shock existed in the first place, and what it reveals about two very different ideas of what a meal is supposed to look like before it's allowed to taste like anything at all.
How do you do it?
Yeah, and then you turn around.
Ooh, that looks good.
Yeah, this is good.
Is this correct? Yes, I believe so. Got a bib, huh?
I just finished my American seafood boil. My favourite part was probably the spuds.
I got some candlelights for y'all down here. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I've got my hen nappy, and I'm very excited about that. It's a nasty.
Slabs, and then
You could do granite.
Huh? Oh, the shower? So the other day.
We're trying the hush puppies at Crab de Jour last time. We're dipping it in some kind of sauce. I don't know what this is.
oh,
This is delicious.
and divine, isn't it? Isn't it?
Oh, I love it. So maybe
All right, I've been seeing seafood boil on my For You page for ages. I've been wanting to try this. This is the one thing that I found I made everyone try when we came to America for the World Cup. So, love the crab legs. But you know what? The sauce is what was amazing. It was spicy. It was a bit spicier than what I normally like, but it was good. And then there's just so much butter and garlic. It's
Tell them about your drink. We don't have that. Tell them
we got a
your
Long Island tea, and it's an iced one.
It is.
The only thing it's missing is some beans.
Some beans.
I wish I had some beans.
Yeah,
Beans and toast.
Yes. Yeah. This is a delicate.
What did I say?
Somewhere in the folklore of good manners, a plate became more than a plate. It became the boundary that separates food from the table itself. Proof that what is being served has been touched, arranged, and made presentable before it ever reaches a mouth. In most of Europe, that boundary is treated as sacred, especially where seafood is concerned. Shellfish, in particular, has spent centuries being served as a delicacy, and delicacies come with rules. A plate underneath, a knife and fork beside it, a quiet distance kept between the diner and the mess of extraction. So when a visitor sees a seafood boil for the first time, a heap of shrimp, crab, corn, and sausage dumped straight onto brown paper spread across a bare table. The discomfort is not really about hygiene, it is about the missing boundary. Something that always had a frame around it suddenly does not. The origin of that missing frame goes back to the working docks and backyards of the American South, long before seafood boils became something tourists flew across an ocean to try. Fishermen and shrimpers along the Gulf Coast and the Carolina Lowcountry needed a way to cook and eat a catch that was often too large, too messy, and too immediate for formal serving. Newspaper and butcher paper were cheap, absorbent, and disposable. Laid across a table, they caught the butter, the spice, the shells, and the mess, and when the meal ended, the whole thing could simply be balled up and thrown away. There was no kitchen staff standing by to plate individual portions, and there was no need for one. The paper was not a shortcut taken because something better wasn't available. It was the correct tool for a meal built around speed, volume, and people who had spent all day working with their hands and had no intention of pretending otherwise at dinner. What that history quietly encoded into the meal is something most first-time visitors don't consciously register until they're several bites in. A seafood boil removes the one prop that usually tells everyone at the table who is more refined than whom. A plate creates a small, private territory, your portion, arranged for you, separate from mine. Paper on a table creates the opposite. Everyone reaches into the same pile. Everyone gets butter on their fingers in roughly the same amount. There is no elegant way to peel a crab leg, and because there is no elegant way, nobody is expected to find one. The usual quiet performance that happens at a formal dinner table, sitting up straight, using the correct utensil, not appearing too eager, has nowhere to attach itself. The mess is not a flaw in the presentation, it is the entire point of it. This is why the discomfort so many Europeans describe in the first 30 seconds tends to dissolve so completely by the end of the meal. It isn't that the food overrides the initial shock through sheer flavor, although the flavor helps. It's that the absence of a plate turns out to remove something else along with it. The low-grade social vigilance that comes with eating in public. The awareness of being watched and judged by unspoken standards. Once the butter is on everyone's hands, there is genuinely nothing left to perform. What looks, from the outside, like the least dignified way to eat seafood is, from the inside, one of the only ways to eat it without any dignity being at stake at all. It raises a strange possibility that the version of a meal considered proper in one culture might simply be the version with the most social pressure built into it, and that stripping the pressure away rather than adding refinement can be its own kind of luxury, which leaves an open question that has little to do with the food itself. If the plate was never really protecting the seafood, what was it protecting? There is a scientific name for the flicker of hesitation that crosses a person's face in the seconds before their first bite of a seafood boil, and it has nothing to do with taste. It's called food neophobia, the built-in wariness toward anything that doesn't match the mental template a person has spent a lifetime assembling for what a given food is supposed to look like. It is not squeamishness, and it is not pickiness. It is an ancient survival mechanism, the same one that once helped early humans avoid unfamiliar berries and unidentified meat, still quietly running in the background of a modern brain that has never once been in danger from a plate of shrimp. The brain doesn't know the difference between a genuine threat and a broken pattern. It only knows that something in front of it does not match what seafood is supposed to look like, and it flags the mismatch before a single bite has ever been taken. For most Europeans, that template was built early and reinforced constantly. Seafood, in the culinary grammar they grew up with, arrives cold or lightly cooked, plated with restraint, seasoned with a light hand so the flavor of the ocean itself can be tasted underneath. A seafood boil breaks that template on every axis at once. It is hot rather than cold. It is drenched rather than restrained. It is seasoned aggressively enough that the shellfish becomes almost a delivery system for the spice rather than the other way around. To a brain running on the old template, that isn't an upgrade. It's a contradiction, and contradictions get flagged as suspicious before they get evaluated as good. What makes the flip happen so fast, though, is a separate and much older mechanism working in the opposite direction. The brain's reward response to fat, salt, and heat, layered together in the exact combination it is hardwired to crave. Butter alone lights up the brain's reward pathways. Salt alone does the same. Heat intensifies the release of aroma compounds, which is why a hot dish always seems to hit harder than the same ingredients served cold. A seafood boil stacks all three at once, at a volume most European seafood preparations never approach, because the culinary tradition it comes from was never trying to let the ocean speak quietly. It was built by cooks descended from French, African, Spanish, and indigenous influences, all of whom understood spice, not as decoration, but as the main event. The reward signal firing from that first bite is strong enough to override the threat signal that fired seconds earlier, and it does so almost instantly, which is exactly why the hesitation lasts 30 seconds and the conversion happens in 1. This is the part that rarely gets said out loud. The visitor isn't overcoming their disgust through willpower or open-mindedness. Their brain is simply running two competing systems at once, and the reward system wins because the sensory input is strong enough to win outright. There is no moral victory in it, no triumph of cultural courage. It is closer to a rigged contest, one where the food was always going to win the moment it reached the tongue, no matter how uneasy it looked on the way there. Which raises a quieter question worth sitting with, one that has nothing to do with seafood at all. If a lifetime of caution can be overridden in a single bite, how many other things a person has quietly avoided their whole life were never actually dangerous, just unfamiliar in a way the brain had never learned to trust? Somewhere in that same mountain of shrimp and crab sits a fact most people at the table have no reason to know. For most of American history, almost none of what they're eating was considered food worth paying for. Shrimp, crab, and crawfish were abundant along the Gulf Coast and the Carolina Low Country to the point of being a nuisance. The kind of catch that got tangled in nets meant for something else or scooped up by hand from shallow water because it required no boat, no license, and no capital. It was the food of enslaved people, of subsistence fishermen, of families who ate what the water gave them for free because they couldn't afford what didn't come from the water at all. A plate of lobster or crab in colonial New England carried the same reputation. So cheap and so common that servants reportedly negotiated contracts limiting how many times a week they could be forced to eat it. The shift from that reputation to a $110 bag of king crab and shrimp did not happen because the shellfish changed. It happened because the surrounding economy did. As American cities grew wealthier through the 20th century and refrigerated shipping made coastal seafood available far from the coast, something that had once been a marker of poverty slowly became a marker of abundance instead. Not fine dining exactly, but plenty. A seafood boil restaurant doesn't need a trained chef plating individual portions with tweezers. It needs volume, a boiling pot, and a price set by the pound. That structure kept the meal accessible even as the ingredients inside it became genuinely expensive, which is precisely what let king crab and lobster, foods that in most of Europe stay locked behind fine dining prices, show up in the same mesh bag as a $2 potato. The business model never asked the ingredients to become more prestigious. It asked the presentation to stay exactly as unpretentious as it always had been, and let the ingredients quietly upgrade underneath it. Europe never had a version of this reversal, because European seafood mostly skipped the poverty phase altogether. In a landscape of small coastlines and long-established fishing guilds, shellfish was scarce enough, early enough, to be positioned as a luxury from the start. Something plated by someone else, priced by the piece, eaten in restaurants that never needed to justify a bare table because the food itself was never asked to survive as a working man's meal. There was no discount era for oysters in Paris to look back on the way there was for shrimp in Charleston. Which means when a European visitor sits down to a seafood boil, they aren't just encountering an unfamiliar way of eating shellfish. They're encountering a food history that simply never happened where they come from. A rags to riches arc with no European equivalent compressed into a single meal. What makes the moment land for the visitors who learn the backstory afterward is the quiet realization of what they're actually holding in their hands. It is not an indulgence dressed down for casual eating. It is a food that clawed its way up from the bottom of the American diet and never let go of the manners it started with. Still eaten with fingers, still served without ceremony, because the informality was never a costume. It was the meal's original condition, and it simply kept it on the way up. It leaves an odd thought hanging over the table long after the last shell is cracked. The version of luxury being served here isn't the kind that erases where something came from. It's the kind that carries its whole history along with it, unbothered by how humble that history happens to be. The seasoning on a seafood boil rarely gets a second thought once the food arrives. It's simply spicy, filed away as one more feature of an already unfamiliar meal. But that blend didn't arrive by accident, and it isn't the product of one culture reaching for heat because it liked heat. It's the residue of an 18th century expulsion, still showing up on tables 300 years and thousands of miles removed from where it began. In the 1750s, the British Crown forcibly removed thousands of French-speaking Acadian settlers from what is now Nova Scotia, scattering families across the Atlantic world in an event known as Le Grand Dérangement. A significant number eventually resettled in the swamps and bayous of southern Louisiana, a landscape that shared almost nothing with the one they left. Their French culinary instincts, the roux, the slow-built sauces, the technique-first approach to cooking, arrived in a place already shaped by Spanish colonial rule, West African cooking traditions carried over through slavery, and indigenous Choctaw ingredients like filet powder and native peppers. None of those traditions replaced the others. They layered, out of necessity, into something none of them had been on their own. That layering is the actual origin of what gets tasted as too much seasoning today. Cajun spice blends typically combine cayenne, paprika, garlic, and black pepper in proportions built to punch through the natural sweetness of boiled shellfish rather than sit quietly beside it, a habit inherited less from French restraint and more from the West African and Caribbean cooking traditions that treated pepper heat as a structural ingredient, not a garnish. What reads to a first-time European taster as aggressive is more accurately a cooking tradition where 4 separate culinary lineages were forced to negotiate a shared table, and none of them agreed to season quietly. Europe's spice traditions took a fundamentally different path, and the difference explains the gap in expectation almost entirely. Most European coastal cuisines evolved within a single continuous culinary lineage. French technique refined by French cooks, Mediterranean tradition refined by Mediterranean cooks, with centuries to settle into restraint as the marker of skill. A delicate hand with seasoning became proof of respect for the ingredient, the idea being that a good cook lets the fish taste like fish. Cajun cooking never had the luxury of that single lineage, and so it never developed that particular value. It developed a different one, that a dish should carry the fingerprint of everyone who built it all at once without any single influence, quietly winning out over the others. That's the piece that tends to reframe the whole meal for a visitor once they hear it. The seasoning is not a chef showing off, and it's not evidence of unrefined taste. It's a direct, edible record of forced migration, slavery, colonization, and adaptation, compressed into a spice blend that gets poured over shrimp without anyone at the table realizing they're tasting the aftermath of one of the more brutal displacements in North American colonial history. The heat isn't there to overwhelm the seafood. It's there because 4 cultures had to figure out, together and against their will, what a shared meal was even supposed to taste like. And cayenne pepper was part of the answer they landed on. Which makes the seasoning, in the end, the least accidental part of the entire dish. Everything else about a seafood boil, the paper, the mess, the shared pile, grew out of practicality. The spice is the one ingredient that grew out of history refusing to stay separate. Walk into Paletos Baris in Vilnius, or a seafood restaurant in London, Bristol, or Swansea, and you will find the same mesh bag, the same butter-drenched pile, the same instruction to put on gloves and dig in. None of these are American tourist traps built for homesick visitors. They are local businesses, run by local owners, serving local customers who never set foot in Louisiana, people who discovered the format on a phone screen, wanted it enough to build it from scratch, and now queue for it in cities that had never plated a meal this way before. That fact alone is stranger than it first appears, because American food essentially never moves in this direction. The usual traffic runs the other way. Pizza arrived in the United States from Naples and was reshaped into something distinctly American. Sushi arrived from Japan and became rolls stuffed with cream cheese and spicy mayo, a format barely recognizable in Tokyo. Even fried chicken and burgers, now treated as quintessentially American, trace their lineage back through European and West African cooking traditions that were absorbed, altered, and claimed. The United States has spent most of its culinary history as an importer, a country that takes in global food and remakes it in its own image, rarely the other way around. A seafood boil restaurant opening in a Lithuanian old town breaks that pattern almost completely. This is not a global dish being Americanized. It is an American format, mess, gloves, bare table and all, being adopted intact, structure and etiquette included, by a culture that had no prior version of it to blend it into. What makes that adoption possible is something narrower than food itself. The format traveled through video before it ever traveled through trade. A seafood boil doesn't need an immigrant population to carry it across an ocean the way pizza or dumplings once needed. It needs a phone camera pointed at a table of people getting butter on their hands, and a platform willing to show that footage to millions of strangers who have never been to Louisiana and have no intention of going. The dish spread the way a piece of music or a dance spreads, not through migration, but through repeated exposure to an image so visually and emotionally legible that it required no translation. The mess reads the same in every language. That is precisely why it was exportable in a way that quieter, more technique-heavy cuisine rarely is. This is where the meal stops being about seafood at all and starts being about something closer to cultural gravity. Nations exercise soft power through film, music, and language for generations before anyone notices it reshaping something as intimate and habitual as how a stranger in another country chooses to eat dinner. Table manners are among the most conservative things a culture holds onto, inherited from parents, corrected in childhood, rarely questioned as adults. For a European city to abandon its own seafood etiquette in favor of an American one, on purpose by choice, is a small but genuine sign of how far that gravity now reaches. It isn't cultural imposition. No one is required to eat this way. It's closer to cultural attraction operating at a level most people never consciously register, something willingly adopted rather than something imposed. Which leaves the meal, and the 4 facts behind it, pointing at the same quiet conclusion. A seafood boil crossed an ocean, not because it was refined, but because it was honest about exactly what it was. Unpretentious, communal, unwilling to apologize for its own mess. And somewhere between the plate that never arrived and the gloves that did, an entire way of thinking about food, class, and belonging seems to have crossed with it, one bite at a time. Somewhere between the first hesitant reach and the last cracked shell, something quietly shifted that had nothing to do with hunger. The plate never came, and it turned out not to be missed. The seasoning that seemed too aggressive turned out to be carrying 3 centuries of history nobody at the table had asked to taste. What looked, in that first 30 seconds, like the least dignified way to eat a meal, turned out to be one of the only ways to eat it without anyone performing dignity at all, which may be the closest thing this dish has to a secret. None of that explains itself in a single bite. It takes the whole meal, the whole mess, the whole history, sitting quietly underneath the butter before the shift in the room actually starts to make sense. A country that once treated this food as something not worth a plate has turned it into something people now fly across an ocean to sit down for, gloves on, expectations gone, willing to get their hands dirty for it. And somewhere else, in a Lithuanian old town or a British high street, someone opened a restaurant to bring that exact feeling home, without ever fully being able to explain why it worked. So the question worth sitting with isn't really about seafood at all. It's about how many other things, foods, customs, whole ways of doing something ordinary, a person walks past every day, quietly certain they already know how they'd feel about it, without ever once reaching in to find out. What would it take for you to put your hands in first and ask the questions after?